The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by MassMutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. MassMutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a MassMutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at MassMutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to And Colossally, That's History. I'm Matt Bishop.
And I'm Richard Williams. And we're here for one final episode in Series 1.
That's right. We've had a great time, haven't we? Digging through the past over the past few weeks. But before we have a short break ahead of Season 2, which I'm already looking forward to, we've got one more fantastic little chapter of motor racing history to remember and explore.
Yeah, because on this episode we're going to tell the tale of James Hunt and Hesketh racing, perhaps the ultimate underdog success story of F1 in the 1970s.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you there, and we'll be telling the story of how the self-styled biggest little racing team in the world firmly rattled the Formula One establishment by not only winning a Grand Prix, beating mighty Ferrari, no less, but also helping to nurture James Hunt, a fast but crash-prone driver in his early days, into one of Formula One's most charismatic superstars, and a great driver, in my view, which is often overlooked, I think, owing to that remarkable charisma.
So I suppose we should start this story with a bit of background about the man after whom the team was named, Alexander Fermor Hesketh, the third Baron Hesketh. As his name might suggest, he was and is a member of the British aristocracy, a hereditary peer who succeeded to the title aged 4 when his father died.
Yeah, and the family seat was actually Easton Neston near Towcester, which people may know is right on the doorstep of Silverstone. Anyway, he'd had the usual public school education that a member of the aristocracy would have as a boy. But actually, even at that stage of his life, early stage of his life, he was an unconventional character, wasn't he, Richard? Because he didn't finish school.
No, let's say he didn't take advantage of the educational opportunities that were there for him.
Very diplomatic.
He absconded from Ampleforth College in Yorkshire, the famous Catholic school, at the age of 15, went to a crammer and got 3 O-levels, as they were in those days. And then when he was 16, he probably wisely gave up education, formal education altogether, and went into the used car business. His next move was to go to the United States, where he spent a year and a half working for a Californian investment bank, before continuing his journey to Hong Kong to join a shipbroking firm. Then he was back in England in 1971 and set up his own company, Hesketh Finance, with the inheritance given to him on his 21st birthday. And so, with his finances apparently sorted, in 1972, aged just 21, he'd done all this by 21, he turned his attention to his great passion, motor racing.
He did, and he ended up falling in with Antony Horsley, much better known by his nickname, Bubbles. Bubbles Horsley. Now, Bubbles was a very interesting character as well. He was one of a number of wannabe racing drivers who shared a flat, perhaps even a notorious flat, in Pinner Road, Harrow, in the 1960s. Charlie Crichton Stewart was there, Piers Courage, probably the best driver of them. I'd say certainly the best driver of them. Charles Lucas, Jonathan Williams, not the son of Frank Williams, but the other one. And believe it or not, Frank Williams of Williams Grand Prix Engineering, who apparently slept on the sofa most of the time. Anyway, Bubbles spent the mid-60s schlepping to racetracks around Europe with Frank Williams, sleeping in the back of a van and scraping a living from prize money, appearance money, from Formula 3 races. Bubbles wasn't really cutting it as a racing driver. I mean, any more than Frank was. Frank was quick and hairy in a car, but by his own admission was never really good enough to make it as a professional racing driver, and neither was Bubbles. It finally came to an end, really, when they shunted with each other at the Nürburgring, and they went back to England, and Bubbles then started making money, believe it or not, appearing in TV ads. And then, as one did, if one was the kind of person that Bubbles was, he decided to travel around India and Nepal, perhaps to relocate his chakras, who knows. Anyway, you get the idea. Both Alexander Hesketh and Bubbles Horsley were very colourful characters. Anyway, Bubbles came back to England, back to London, where he connected with Alexander Hesketh.
I think Bubbles was trying to sell Hesketh a Rolls-Royce, and he had a company at that precise moment called Horsley's Horseless Carriages. So that's how they...
Bit of a tongue twister. Anyway, it was a bit of a foolhardy venture for them to start a racing team because, they didn't know much about it, really. And there is that old adage, isn't there, which I think is attributed to Richard Branson. If you want to become a millionaire, start off as a billionaire and launch an airline. Well, it's a bit like that in motor racing. And I think Rob Walker used to say similar things. Luckily, he was very wealthy, very, very wealthy. Anyway, Hesketh did at least seem aware of that. Lord Hesketh, I mean. He said he had no interest in squirreling away his money. He wanted to spend it, enjoy it. He wanted to spend it on something fun, which included and centred on going racing with his mates. So he and Bubbles bought a Formula 3 car, and the plan was to take it around Europe with Bubbles driving still, just having fun.
Yeah, Hesketh himself decided quite early on that driving was far too risky, and that actually he very much liked being the team boss and living up to his image of a colourful benefactor. And perhaps also at about £200 plus, he was probably a bit too big for an F3 cockpit.
I mean, Bubbles was no slimline chap either, to be fair, but slimmer than Le Patron. Anyway, go on.
Well, when they eventually made it into F1, on their team shirts, they had everyone's name embroidered. And Hesketh, as you've just suggested, chose Le Patron. And I'm not sure whether that was because it was originally used by the famous French car constructor Ettore Bugatti, who was known as Le Patron, or in honour of the message that you used to see on the door of French restaurants, Le Patron mange ici. But it gives you an idea of his character.
It does indeed.
And of course it was when Hesketh and Bubbles were at an F3 event in Chimay in Belgium that they'd first properly been introduced to one James Hunt.
Indeed. And it's worth remembering at this point how young they all were, because they were all still in their early or maximum mid-20s. I think Hunt was 24 or 25 when he met Hesketh, and when Bubbles and Hesketh offered him the chance to be their second driver at that point. Sounds strange to think that, but Bubbles was number one and Hunt was number two. And actually, Hunt's background wasn't too dissimilar to Hesketh's. He'd also had a public school education at Wellington, and he actually hadn't really been very interested in motor racing before, typical Hunt, before forming what he called an instant commitment to the sport after a chance invitation to Snetterton, the Snetterton circuit, the day before his 18th birthday, which was pretty late even in those days, and of course would be prohibitively late now to start off as a racing driver. Anyway, he eventually got into club racing a Mini at first, like so many back in the day, then Formula 4, then Formula 3. But at the point he met Hesketh and Bubbles, James had a bit of a reputation as a crasher, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. The nickname Hunt the Shunt was actually coined by Max Mosley, for whom Hunt raced for a period in Formula 3. Mosley said later, quite rightly, that Hunt didn't really crash that much more than his rivals. The name just rhymed. You know, it was good for a tabloid headline, I suppose. And it stuck. And in fairness, when he did have a shunt, it tended to be a pretty massive one. There was a time during a Formula Ford race at Alton Park when he'd ended up being catapulted into the lake after cartwheeling off the track while trying to avoid another driver's spinning car. Later he said that he'd probably have drowned if he'd been wearing seatbelts, which he wasn't wearing because they weren't yet compulsory and he couldn't afford them anyway. And there was another famous incident at the Formula 3 Daily Express Trophy race at Crystal Palace in 1970, when he tangled with a chap called Dave Morgan, who tried to take second place from him on the last lap of the race. And after his car came to rest, minus its wheels, James got out, ran over to Morgan, and knocked him to the ground with a single punch. An RAC tribunal was convened to consider the matter, and they acquitted Hunt while banning Morgan for several months. But, you know, it was another shunt to add to the list.
Yeah, but so Morgan was punished for being beaten up?
Well, yeah, but he was actually punished for an extremely dangerous manoeuvre.
Yes, okay.
And James's possibly partially justified reaction was he was absolved from that. And fast forwarding to the meeting with Hesketh and Bubbles in Belgium, James had actually just been sacked by the Works March team a few weeks earlier for saying that their car was no good. So despite being quick, his racing career was really going nowhere at that point.
He was never hesitant in sharing his opinions, James Hunt.
Never backward in that matter.
Absolutely. And he never really got out of the habit of using his fists when he was angry, and he was often angry. This is fast-forwarding a bit, but it's an interesting story. At Mosport in Canada in 1977, the Canadian Grand Prix, so obviously, as I say later, when he was reigning world champion, because he won the championship in 1976, he was nerfed off the track when he was lapping his McLaren teammate, Jochen Mass, and the nerfer was Mass. I mean, the absolute cardinal sin by a number 2 driver is to have your number 1 driver off the track. Anyway, Hunt had been dicing for the lead with Mario Andretti in the Lotus, Hunt in the McLaren, Andretti in the Lotus, and they'd been miles ahead of everyone else. But Andretti actually soon retired himself, so Hunt would have won the race easily. Anyway, Hunt was furious. He'd been nerfed off by his teammate, and when a marshal came over to guide Hunt away from his crashed McLaren, again, he decked him with one punch.
Now, that's something you don't do, isn't it? Hit a marshal, a man who's there to save your life.
Totally wrong. Anyway, Hunt realised that. You can see the footage now. You can find it. He immediately stooped down to pull the poor guy up, and you can see his body language. He's apologising profusely. He was fined for that, James was, $2,000 for punching the marshal and $750 more for walking back to the pits, quote, in an unsafe manner. Guess why? Because he walked on the track.
What priorities?
I know. Anyway, back to Hesketh, early Hesketh. It didn't look like that particular iteration of Hesketh racing would really go much farther when, in a 1972 British Grand Prix support race at Brands Hatch, Bubbles crashed his car in practice and Hunt crashed his car in the race. But James wasn't going to give up, and he managed to persuade, again, Max Mosley, the boss of March, to lend him a car for the final races of the Formula 2 season of 1972. And actually, he began to do really rather well. He finished third in the final round at Alton Park, behind the works marches of two real aces, Ronnie Peterson and that year's champion Niki Lauda. And by that stage, I think Bubbles had realised this wasn't going to be for him, and he'd given up driving, had become team manager. And so the plan was for Hesketh Racing and James Hunt to have a full-on assault on the European Formula 2 Championship for 1973. But then, after just one race, they decided that their Surtees car, the Surtees they'd bought for that, was far too uncompetitive, not nearly good enough, old boy. So they thought, sod Formula 2, let's do Formula 1. Just imagine that. Just imagine the brass neck of it. They couldn't hack it in Formula 2, so instead of dropping down to Formula 3, they moved up to Formula 1.
And so, with the Hesketh team poised on the brink of their greatest adventure, that feels like a good time for our first ad break.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Before the break, we mentioned Hesketh deciding to shelve their plans to race in Formula 2 in 1973 and instead step straight up to Formula 1. As James put it, Alexander's attitude was that we were doing pretty badly in Formula 2, and for very little additional cost, we could do badly in Formula 1. But actually, they didn't do very badly. It went remarkably well, didn't it? James took to the increase in power and a faster car like a duck to water. Driving again a Surtees, at this time a TS9B Formula 1 car, he took third place in the non-championship Race of Champions at Brands Hatch in 1973, behind Peter Gethin and Denny Hulme. And here is one of my favourite #Anorak fact. Hunt and Hulme were in Formula 1 cars, Hunt in a Surtees and Hulme in a McLaren, but Gethin won the race in a Formula 5000 Chevron. One of only two races in which a Formula 5000 car won against Formula 1 cars. And the other, for those who really like #Anorak facts, was the 1969 Madrid Grand Prix, which is a non-championship race, which was, in fact, Max Mosley's only Formula 1 outing on his birthday. But that is definitely another series of #Anorak facts.
I'm prostrate with admiration. Anyway, that third place for Hunt at Brands felt like a really important result for the Hesketh team, and it encouraged them to make two decisions. First, they bought a March 731 Formula 1 chassis from their old mate Max Mosley.
Max Mosley's getting quite a bit of airtime in this, isn't he?
He certainly is.
He is, yeah.
And then they hired somebody to engineer the car, and that was a young engineer called Harvey Postlethwaite, or Doc as he became known in the team, since he had a PhD in mechanical engineering. And they'd actually poached him from March. The team's headquarters and workshop was in the stables at Easton Neston, the Hesketh family seat, and actually the only surviving private house built by the great architect Nicholas Hawksmoor in 1702. And that's my idea of a #Anorak fact.
I am also prostrate with admiration, Richard.
Anyway, those stables, they were a bit different in a stately home, a bit different from Ken Tyrrell's woodshed on the one hand, or Ferrari's fully equipped factory in Maranello on the other. But of course, this approach was very much of its time, coming out of the 60s into the 70s. But it's completely impossible to go into Formula One racing like that now. You can't just buy a car off the peg, as it were, and you can't run a one-car team either.
No, you can't. I mean, every Formula One team these days has to design and manufacture their car themselves. But in those days, you could just buy an X-Works Formula One car, or actually, if it was a March, a new one, because they didn't mind selling cars to customers, and you just go racing with it. Anyway, even though Hesketh could and did do that, it's fair to say that their exploits were nonetheless being treated with considerable scepticism by the motor racing establishment, the Formula One establishment, as you might expect when you look up the setup and the characters involved. I mean, it was all so flamboyant. Hooray Henrys, I think, was the term. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. But there are two things to consider as well. First, everyone involved in Hesketh was much younger, as we've said before, than people running what might be called normal or serious Formula One teams. I mean, Hesketh himself very much wanted it to be a disrupting team. He wanted to be a disruptor. He was going to race on his terms. The great writer, our mutual friend Gerald Donaldson, wrote a great biography of James Hunt, a really good book. You should, if you're listening and you haven't bought it and read it, you should buy it and read it. And in it, he outlines how a prime motivator for Hesketh was to bait, that was Hesketh's word, to bait what he described as, and the following quote, the pompous motor racing establishment. I mean, from a peer of the realm to say that says something. Anyway, Gerald Donaldson, Jerry quotes Hesketh as saying as follows, at the top of every undertaking, in sport, in politics, you name it, the establishment always like to preserve the impression that they have a number of great skills and arts which are not easily acquired or, even more to the point, impossible to acquire. And one of the great advantages of being young is that you can take that on. You don't mind driving into brick walls and picking yourself up and carrying on. With perseverance and a bit of luck, you can make huge strides. And that's what we did.
Well, yes, it was an interesting approach from someone who was a hereditary peer, could be seen as very much part of the establishment himself, albeit not in motor racing.
Yes.
But anyway, where should Hesketh turn up for their first race? Of course, it was Monaco.
Where else?
And there are some wonderful descriptions of their setup. Again, I'm going to quote directly from Jerry Donaldson's biography of James Hunt. Quote, Hesketh Racing's headquarters at the Monaco Grand Prix was aboard the 162-foot Southern Breeze, one of the biggest yachts in the harbour, but not big enough for Le Patron, who was disappointed to find another team had commandeered a craft 20 feet longer than his. He took some solace in having the most exotic tender in the harbour, his Bell Jet Ranger helicopter, with which he whisked his guests back and forth from Nice airport. For ground transportation, there was a pinstriped Rolls-Royce Corniche, an exotic new Porsche Carrera, and an expensive Suzuki motorcycle. The galley in the Southern Breeze was presided over by a master chef in white regalia, but the crew seemed composed mostly of scantily clad, nubile young ladies. Those are Jerry's words, not mine.
Yes, but I'm sure Hunt didn't mind that element one little bit.
He didn't.
No. But apart from Hunt's fondness for pursuing women, which was notorious, and a big thing with him, you can just imagine how all that glam, that flamboyance, would have been, completely at odds with the approach of a team like Ferrari. Well, actually, the approach of any of the others, in fact. I mean, when you put out a public image like that, it's very hard to be taken seriously by serious racing folk. And racing folk are very serious. But actually, from a racing point of view, Hesketh, they were taking it quite seriously. And that's why they actually did pretty well straight away. For all his partying, James was very serious about his racing. In fact, he recalled being, quote, a shaking wreck on the grid for his debut Formula One Grand Prix at Monaco, as you say, and also, in his own words, quote, puking all over the place before it, which is actually something he did before many, more or less every race thereafter. And Hesketh Racing started scoring points in Formula One more or less straight away. And that was when you had to be in the top 6 to score points, of course.
Yeah, I think that signing Postlethwaite was an indication that they were really serious.
Yeah, I agree.
Postlethwaite is one of those who are in the line of British racing car designers that goes back to John Cooper and Colin Chapman, and today goes all the way up to Adrian Newey. And there's some very, very brilliant people, John Barnard and all sorts of others. And he was one of those, he was a great racing car designer and engineer. So, James qualified 18th of the 24 cars that started at Monaco, and he was up to 6th, amazingly. Can you imagine at Monaco going from 18th to 6th before his Cosworth engine gave out? But, of course, they still had a huge party on the yacht afterwards, which had, irrespective of the result, that didn't really matter.
Why am I not surprised?
Yep. So they must have been doing something right, because in the end they ended up performing better than the Works March cars. They contested 7 further races in 1973, and James was 6th in France, 4th in Britain, 2 seconds faster in qualifying than the Works Marchers, 3rd in the Netherlands at Zandvoort, and then a very close second behind Ronnie Peterson's Lotus in the USA at the season-ending race at Watkins Glen. And that was a seriously good result for what appeared to be a not-so-serious team.
Exactly. And Hunt, or Superstar, as Hesketh liked to call him, was clearly developing into a driver of some note, some real class, and absolutely shedding his old Hunt the Shunt reputation. Whenever people talk about him, James Hunt, they talk about his playboy lifestyle. And it's true. He did love a good time. He did like a drink. He loved the company of women, many women. Look, he even had the legend Sex Breakfast of Champions, a patch showing that legend sewn onto his race suit, which was seen as a bit of a laugh back then, but would be obviously seen as totally unacceptable now. Anyway, I think a lot of that Playboy stuff unfairly overshadows the fact that Hunt was becoming a very, very, very good driver. This is my opinion. In fact, from midway through 1976, I know we're jumping forward a little bit, but just it's worth pointing out, from midway through 1976 on into all of 1977, he would have been quite a lot of pundits' choice at the time for best driver in the world, ahead of Niki Lauda, ahead of Ronnie Peterson, ahead of Mario Andretti, ahead of Carlos Reutemann, ahead of Emerson Fittipaldi, all of whom tend to rank well above Hunt in surveys, in motorsport magazines' websites that are conducted from time to time today, half a century later. In fact, my opinion as well, in 1977, if you take that season on its own, and perhaps that was Hunt's best, only perhaps Jody Scheckter could really rival James Hunt for the best driver in the world mantle. Anyway, that should probably be another and Colossally That's History podcast one day, shouldn't it, Richard?
Yes, I agree pretty much with what you say about Hunt. I think unless you were around at the time, it's hard to get past the image and appreciate how good he was, how completely competitive, and as you say, up there with the very best of his time. No doubt about that. As a human being, possibly another man. I love the quote from his mother, who said, "I love him dearly, but I'd hate to be married to him." When your mother says that.
Yeah.
And his reputation has been a bit distorted as well by the passing of time. I think, Rush was a very enjoyable film. about his rivalry with Niki Lauda. But what it distorted was the fact that he and Lauda were the best of friends. You know, sure, they were rivals on the track. Sure, they had one of the great rivalries of all time in 1976. But they were real pals. You know, they went out together, drinking together, doing other stuff together. No question they were interested in the same kind of things, although somehow it's only Hunt who's got the reputation for it. But there we are. As for how they were seen by Hunt and Hesketh was seen by their rivals, you have to remember it was then only 15 years since the arrival of the Coopers and Lotuses in Formula One, which overturned everything. You know, there were grandee teams at the time like Ferrari and Maserati, and Cooper and Lotus, they were the disruptors of the time. And there may have been a sneaking feeling among some of the people who've been around a bit longer that here we were seeing another team coming along to, you know, albeit more flamboyantly and with a less serious kind of attitude, apparently. They were there to upset the established order too. Anyway, so that was 1973, and then in their first season, and then in 74, things got more serious still when Hesketh, who was full of big plans always, announced that the team was building its own car, designed and built in the stables by the Doc, Harvey Postlethwaite, and a bunch of mechanics with nicknames like Beaky and Ferret and Ball of String.
Ball of String, what a great nickname. But anyway, that was their plan, but the new car wasn't actually ready for the two opening races of the season, which in those days were always, or almost always, in South America, in other words, Argentina, then Brazil. So the new Hesketh 308 made its race debut not in South America, but in the non-championship race of champions at Brands Hatch, exactly, I think more or less exactly a year after the team's first Formula One appearance. And I should say that like the March before it, it was, of course, painted in very striking white livery with red and blue stripes. Hesketh was, Lord Hesketh was very much a patriot, albeit one who didn't think too much of the more sober British racing green that British teams had previously run, but he was definitely a patriot. Anyway, there were plenty of retirements for Hunt in 1974. DNFs did not finish. But there were also some very positive, very strong, very encouraging results, including third places at Anderstorp, Sweden, Österreichring, Austria, and Watkins Glen, USA. Actually, Hunt was always super quick at the Glen, always. But the biggest triumph that season, 1974, arguably the team's breakthrough result, in fact, came in another non-championship race, Formula One race, the International Trophy at Silverstone, where most of the Formula One field assembled. You have to remember, Formula One teams entered non-championship Formula One races in those days. They were a big deal. And as I say, Hunt was always super quick at the Glen, Watkins Glen, but he was always brilliant at Silverstone too. He took the pole, I was going to say by a mile, not actually a mile, but by 1.7 seconds, a huge margin, and he won the race the next day brilliantly, despite making a bad start. Actually, he often made bad start. By his own admission, he used to chide himself for making bad starts in those days. But it was a great drive, a great win, and a great shot in the arm for the team.
Yeah, he went from 15th to 1st with no clutch throughout the race and no knob on the gear lever either after it fell off on the grid, and I'll refrain from making any of the obvious jokes there. He actually took the lead by going past Ronnie Peterson's Lotus on the inside at Woodcote, which was pretty jaw-dropping and actually made a lot of people look at him in a different light, just that one overtake. And when he pulled into the pits, after taking the checkered flag, he's said to have flung off his helmet and launched into a rendition of the Dambusters March. How very British. And possibly a reference to the fact that the driver finishing second, a good 30 seconds behind him, was Jochen Mass.
Obviously a German driver.
Indeed.
And that feels like a good time to take our final break. So, now, we're up to 1975 in our story of James Hunt and Hesketh, and here's where things start to get a little bit more serious still, don't they, Richard?
Yes, Hesketh had given the go-ahead for a new car, but by this point he was rapidly running out of cash, so there was a bit of an economy drive. And 1975 was looking like a very competitive season, with several teams doing well. At the beginning, there was the shadow team, for Jean-Pierre Jarier took pole in the first two races, and there was Carlos Reutemann and Carlos Pace in the Brabhams, which were looking quick. Emerson Fittipaldi in the McLaren, and the two Ferraris of Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni, who were finally coming into some sort of form. Hunt and the Hesketh 308 finished 1974 with fourth in Canada and third at Watkins Glen. So second in Buenos Aires at the start of the 75 season wasn't that much of a surprise. And actually he'd have won, but he was in the lead when he spun late on, and that let Emerson Fittipaldi past. But then there were 5 retirements in a row before Zandvoort. 3 of them were mechanical, and there were a couple of crashes, Hunt the Shunt again. But by that time, Lauda and the Ferrari 312T had begun their streak of wins. You know, Ferrari was really coming on song. I talked about the little economy drive that the Hesketh team were on. At that point, Bubbles Horsley was selling T-shirts. They had the famous Super Bear on the front. Do you remember that was a little bear in a helmet?
Yes,
and that was something that Hesketh had seen on a postcard in an airport terminal and bought one and drawn a helmet on it, and they made T-shirts. And they were selling them actually to raise the money to buy engines, because the Cosworth DFV had gone up from £7,500 to £9,000.
Prohibitive.
That season, absolutely prohibitive. And Hunt was actually driving pretty much for nothing that season for expenses. He was supposed to get £75,000, but they were in such trouble that he was not taking his salary. And later, the next season, when he'd moved on, he got about half of it, and he got the Porsche that Hesketh had loaned him, so he got to keep that as well. But when they got to Zandvoort for round 8 of the championship, that's where they had their great fairy tale moment.
Absolutely. And let's just add to what you've just said in terms of context. Niki Lauda and Ferrari were on a roll at this point. They'd won the last 3 previous Grand Prix. They'd won at Monaco, Zolder and Anderstorp. So, you know, Lauda had 32 points, which is a lot of points in old money, 32 points in the Drivers' World Championship when they arrived at Zandvoort. And Hunt had 7, so 32 against 7. And then Lauda and his teammate, Clay Regazzoni, qualified first and second at Zandvoort, a Ferrari front row lockout. I don't think we called them front row lockouts.
I don't think we did, no.
But that's what it was. Now, Hunt qualified third, but even so, everyone was expecting the Ferrari steamroller to win again, making it 4 wins in a row. And don't forget, that year's Ferrari 312T was a brilliant car. It had a powerful, torquey, tractable, and therefore very drivable flat 12 engine. It therefore had quite a bit more power than the Cosworth V8s in all the other cars, except the BRM, don't forget. But I think we have to concede that was a dreadful car in 1975.
Also, the Ferrari flat 12 probably cost a bit more than £9,000.
Absolutely, quite a lot more than £9,000. Anyway, Lauda was hitting his stride as a seriously world-class driver. Regazzoni was a great backup, and the Ferrari team had well and truly relearned the art of winning. Anyway, at Zandvoort, it was a wet-dry race, so in other words, wet, damp anyway at the start. So all the cars went to the grid on wet tyres. But as the race progressed and the track surface dried, finally, and it always happens at roughly the same time, everyone dived into the pits for slick tyres. Now, you have to remember, tyre stops were a real rarity back then. They only really happened for punctures or big weather changes. And pit crews were therefore not only far smaller than they are now, but also far less well-grooved than, you know, the super choreographed, almost balletic performances that we see nowadays, 19 guys changing all 4 tyres in 2 seconds flat. That didn't happen back then. And at Zandvoort in 1975, Hunt's tyre change took, apparently, less than half a minute. And that was regarded as pretty tasty in those days.
Well, congratulations to Beaky, Ferret and Ball of String.
Exactly. And probably not many others helping them. No, not 19 of them who've practiced it, every day for the past year. Anyway, Jean-Pierre Jarier, who you've mentioned, who was already showing real pace in the shadow at the beginning of that year particularly. Jarier was always quick in South America. We don't know why. Anyway, he was a factor in the race for a while, as was Scheckter in the Tyrrell, Jody Scheckter, and Clay Regazzoni in the other Ferrari. But by the time all the tyre stops had taken place and the race had shaken down, it became a head-to-head battle. Mano a mano, I think is the phrase, between Hunt and Lauda. And with 20 laps to go, on a now bone-dry track, with no more rain forecast, it was a case of may the best man win. Hunt led in his red, white and blue Hesketh, but only by a car length, with Lauda's mighty, all-conquering Ferrari, resplendent in Rosso Corsa, just behind. May the best man win. I mean, a famous sporting phrase, of course. And on this day, in his Hesketh, the team run by a bunch of hooray Henrys, James Hunt was the best man. It was a wonderful victory. And in terms of what we'd now call feel-good factor, but we probably didn't call it then, Hunt and Hesketh's win at Zandvoort in 1975, in my opinion, is right up there with the great wins in Formula One history. What do you reckon? Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's the race that showed that the Hesketh team wasn't the Bullingdon Club on wheels. It's well put, yes. And, you go back and think of great underdog wins in Grand Prix racing. If you go back to the 30s, there would be Tazio Nuvolari at the Nürburgring in an Alfa Romeo beating 8 Mercedes and 8 Auto Unions on home ground. Brilliant drive. That was one of the greats. And then 1958, I think, Stirling Moss at Buenos Aires in a little rear-engined Cooper 2-litre against the 2.5-litre full Formula One machines and beating the Ferraris through sheer cleverness, strategy. And that was a great, and that was also a British team. And that was a great underdog win. We've had a few. I mean, the Shadow team's first win in 1977, Alan Jones, obviously went on to be a great world champion, but in those days he wasn't. That was his first win, and nobody expected Shadow to win. There have been many. So, as we've said, that win in Zandvoort really was the pinnacle for Hesketh racing, although Hunt did secure further podiums in France and Austria, where he was second both times. And he also ended up being classified fourth that year in the final World Championship standings, which was an incredible result when you consider the opposition and the strength. Massively impressive. But Bubbles Horsley told me just after James died in 1993 that the team had only managed to get to Paul Ricard 2 weeks after that glorious win at Zandvoort because he'd sold Le Patron's roller without first informing his owner. He knew they didn't have the money to get to the south of France. They just won a Grand Prix. And he thought, what can I sell? And he stood at the doorway of the stables at Easton Neston and he saw Hesketh's Rolls Royce. So he flogged it. Yeah. And he told him after, he was furious to begin with, but then that second place was worth it, was worth a roller, clearly. An incredible thing. But, that's the kind of team they were. Yeah. Look, I guess the Hesketh story always seemed, this sounds a bit cruel, but perhaps destined to end in tears, or end anyway, didn't it? I mean, the fun couldn't last forever. And the money really was running out, as you say. And sponsorship was becoming an important part of the financing of any Formula One team by the mid-70s. And the Hesketh team never really embraced it. Never really had any sponsors worth any note. And Hesketh wanted his cars painted in pristine white with tasteful red and blue stripes. And that doesn't really work when you're trying to deck out the livery with paying sponsors, which by that time, the mid-70s, all the other teams were doing. And the UK economy was in recession in the mid-70s. And that hit Hesketh, Lord Hesketh, pretty hard. So I think it was at the stroke of midnight on the 14th of November 1975. Hesketh sadly wound up the team. So, what happened next, Richard?
Well, I suppose it's not surprising, given his Grand Prix win and all those second places, that Hunt got a very good offer from McLaren for the following season. He'd been racing without being paid, basically, so he needed money. So a good offer from a very good team he was going to take. And there, of course, he realised all the potential that he'd shown at Hesketh by becoming world champion in that famous long battle in 1976 with Niki Lauda, which I'm sure we'll cover in detail in another episode.
I'm sure, and I hope we will. But it's worth also saying that the fact that Hunt got that McLaren drive for 1976 was the result of a stroke of remarkable luck for him. Because Emerson Fittipaldi had just done 2 excellent seasons for McLaren, winning the World Championship in 1974, which was his second World Championship, because he'd won for Lotus in 1972, and McLaren's first, and then finishing second in the World Championship to Lauda in 1975. So he'd had 2 seasons for McLaren, finished first in one season, second in the other, and everyone was expecting him and McLaren to be real contenders for the World Championship again in 1976. That McLaren M23 was a very, very competitive car. But then Emerson suddenly upped and left, moving to his brother Wilson's all-Brazilian Copersucar team. I mean, Copersucar was a plucky effort, and well done to the Fittipaldi brothers for trying it, for the glory of Brazil, if you like, but it never really got anywhere. I think it had one podium, Brazil 1978, and a few other placings, but Emo never. I mean, he won 14 Grand Prix already and 2 World Championships, but he never won another Grand Prix again. But of course, happy ending, because re-nicknamed Emo, which he was never called in Formula One, but he was called when he got to the States, he became a winning machine in IndyCar. Well, that's another story, perhaps even another podcast. Anyway, it worked out for Hunt, who gratefully accepted Emerson's suddenly vacant McLaren. So anyway, back to Hesketh. With Hunt gone, Bubbles finally found a couple of sponsors, including, we used to call them girly mags, did we not?
Top shelf mags.
Top shelf, yes, yeah. Perhaps top shelf mags. Penthouse was the sponsor, and the cigarette papers people, Rizla. I mean, can't help noticing that both of which might have been more appropriate as sponsors in James Hunt's day. But anyway, that kept the Hesketh name alive in Formula One for a couple more seasons. But there were no more glory days.
And the Doc moved on to Walter Wolf Racing, owned by a Canadian businessman, Walter Wolf. And for that team, Jody Scheckter, in Postlethwaite's car, won 3 Grand Prix and was in contention for the 1977 world title. He was eventually beaten only by Niki Lauda and Ferrari. And Postlethwaite would go on to have a tremendous career, working for Ferrari especially, and then Tyrrell and Sauber. And he was actually heading Honda's Formula One project when he suddenly died of a heart attack while the team were testing in Barcelona in 1999.
Very sad. He was a great guy, wasn't he?
He was a really great guy and a great engineer. And the Honda effort was aborted, but who knows what would have happened if he'd carried on with it. Anyway, as for Alexander Hesketh himself, although he was a long-standing member of the House of Lords, he'd taken no active part in politics until after the IRA bomb attack in Brighton, when Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, visited him at Eton Neston and told him that it was his duty to serve in the House of Lords on a regular basis. And from that point point, he worked under Thatcher, whom he described as the most outstanding person I ever worked with.
Even more outstanding than James Hunt?
Apparently. Which might have seemed a bit of a conflict with his anti-establishment, rebel, anarchist, as he once described himself, approach to his racing team.
Indeed, and he did, I believe, eventually hold a number of ministerial positions, including government chief whip in the House of Lords. And from 1993 to 2000, he was also president of the BRDC, the British Racing Drivers Club, which of course owns Silverstone. So, summing up, Richard, how do you look back on Hesketh racing?
Well, there were some sad postscripts, not just Postlethwaite, but of course James Hunt died of a heart attack at the age of 45 in 1993. And I remember Alexander Hesketh speaking at his memorial service and saying his career was dogged by criticism which had nothing to do with his ability, and the judgment on his career will improve as the years go by, which I think will one day come true if it hasn't already.
And I think we have been saying that in this podcast.
We have indeed. Hesketh himself, well, he lost not his title, but his seat in the House of Lords when some hereditary peers were abolished. The number was reduced, and he was one of those who were reduced. And eventually, rather sadly, he had to sell Easton Neston, including the stables, and 500 acres of the estate, in 2005 for about 15 million quid to a Russian-born fashion retailer who also owns Madonna's old house in the Hollywood Hills.
My goodness.
Another, well, I wouldn't call that an anorak fact, more a sort of fur coat fact.
Yes.
But anyway, Hesketh racing lives on as a happy memory of a less formal and more spontaneous time in Formula One. I mean, can you imagine if they'd had Drive to Survive back then? What they'd have had to go on in the Hesketh pit? That would have been fun.
It would have been magnificent, actually.
And their achievement is all the more impressive when you think of the teams from that era that didn't make the slightest impression, with more or less the same resources. You know, you think of Trojan and Ensign, Mackie, Hill, Linkar, all those kind of teams that bolted a Cosworth engine into their own chassis and didn't really go anywhere.
Very good point. I mean, I think we could just say about Hill, obviously, if Graham Hill hadn't died so tragically, who knows what might have happened there.
That's true.
But the point's well made. There were a lot of those British Garage East teams that didn't do half as well or a quarter as well as Hesketh. But Hesketh was never the same without Hunt. We have to agree with that. But Hunt's best days came after Hesketh. He was already a super driver by 1975, and he became a great one in 1976 and 1977. He won the championship for McLaren in 1976 and won 3 Grand Prix in 77 and could easily have won more. But for unreliable Cosworth engines at the time. But his star shone bright only briefly. By 1978, the McLaren was off the pace, and he was bored. He was bored by that McLaren being off the pace. And in 1979, he was now in the Wolf, one-car team. He stopped altogether halfway through the year. He did Monaco and called it a day.
I think he'd become aware of mortality at that point.
I think you're right.
Too.
He was bored and frightened.
And I think he was partly frightened because the car was bad.
Yes.
And, if he wasn't competitive, what's the point of risking your life?
I think it kept breaking. Wolf kept breaking.
Yeah. And so I think he was, fear came into it.
I think bored and frightened is what happened. But, there is a phrase which I don't necessarily always subscribe to, but it is everything happens for a reason. And he became one of the all-time great TV commentators after that, didn't he? Obviously in partnership with Murray Walker.
Yeah, he did.
Absolute yin and yang, totally different types, but somehow they gelled. And it was wonderful for Formula One fans. And here's a strange little story. One sunny afternoon in June 1993, when I was features editor of Car magazine, and I was driving back to the editorial offices, which were then in Clerkenwell in central London, central East London, in a press test car. I can't actually remember what one, but something I'd been road testing. And I was driving back, cutting off I'd come along from probably, I think, West Sussex, along into London on the A3, and then I took a shortcut through Southfields, which is near Wimbledon, which of course where James Hunt lived. And suddenly I was driving along just a residential road, and suddenly shot out in front of me this lean, bare-topped chap, hippie-ish, I thought, on an old sit-up-and-beg bicycle, and he suddenly wobbled his way out of a side road right in front of me. And I wasn't driving too fast at all, but I still had to absolutely lock up all four wheels to emergency stop and avoid him. He heard the screech of tyres, he wobbled a bit more as a result, and toppled onto the floor. He picked himself up, dusted himself down, apologised, "So sorry, old chap," and went on his way. It was James Hunt. 2 days later, he had a fatal heart attack. He was 45. Very, very sad. Anyway, I'm sure we'll cover other aspects of James Hunt's life and times in a future episode, and I look forward to doing so. But that feels like the perfect time to say, for the final time in this first series, and colossally, that's history.
A big thank you for joining us for this episode, and indeed the rest of Series 1. We've had a great time telling these stories, and we're looking forward to telling some more after a short break.
Yes, and we'll be back before you know it. But until then, please keep spreading the word about the show. And if you want to get in touch in the meantime, you can. You can reach us on podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm at the Bish1, and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
Until we meet again, goodbye.
Goodbye.
And colossally, that's
History.
The Athletic.